The silence at the dinner table hit me like a physical thing. 11 people seated around a mahogany table that probably cost more than my first car. Crystal glasses catching the light from a chandelier I'd estimate at $40,000. And every single one of them staring at me with the same expression, the polite, practiced smile people use when they're watching something embarrassing happen to someone else. My daughter Claire sat 3 seats away, studying the embroidered edge of her linen napkin like it held the secrets of the universe. She wouldn't look at me. That's the part I keep coming back to, even now. Not what Derek said. Not the laughter that followed. Just the way my daughter found the most fascinating napkin in the history of formal dining and refused to raise her eyes. Derek Calloway leaned back in his chair at the head of the table, his parents' table, though you'd never know it from the way he commanded the room, and he smiled at me with all the warmth of a man who's just won something. "I should probably clarify, Walter," he said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life worried about a bill. "When I told Richard you were coming tonight, I may have given him the impression you were still in business. I hope you don't mind that I corrected myself." He tilted his head toward the man seated at his right, Richard Hartwell, senior managing partner at Callaway Meridian Capital, Derek's mentor, the man whose firm had made Derek's career. "I told him, you're retired. Enjoying the simpler life," he said, "simpler life the way you'd say bless his heart." Richard Hartwell looked at me with curious eyes and said nothing. Derek continued, unable to stop now that he'd started. "Walter runs a little handyman operation out of his garage, actually. Well ran. He's been fully retired for a few years now, just puttering around the house." Another smile. Claire always says her father is a real salt-of-the-earth type. Someone at the end of the table made a soft sound that might have been a stifled laugh. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. And that's when I made the decision that I want to be clear about, because people have asked me since if what I did was about revenge. The answer is no. What I did in the weeks that followed wasn't about making Derek Calloway suffer. It was about making sure my daughter understood what she had chosen to walk beside. That's different. At least, that's what I told myself in the quieter moments when I wasn't entirely sure. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 63 years old. I live in a house in Denton, Texas that I bought for $220,000 in 1997 and have never felt the need to leave, despite the fact that I could afford to live almost anywhere in the continental United States in considerable comfort. The house has 3 bedrooms, a covered porch where I drink my coffee every morning, and a garage that does indeed contain tools, though I'd call what I do in there woodworking rather than puttering. I drive a 2009 Ford F-250 with a dent above the rear wheel well that I've been meaning to fix for 4 years. I wear the same 3 brands of flannel shirt in rotation, from October through April. These are the facts that Derek Calloway assembled into his portrait of me, and he wasn't wrong about any of them. He was only wrong about what they meant. 31 years ago, I started a regional freight logistics company called Briggs Transit out of a rented warehouse in Fort Worth with 11 employees and 2 leased trucks. I worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for the first 4 years. I drove routes myself when drivers called in sick. I handled dispatch from my kitchen table at 2 in the morning. I missed birthday parties and school plays, and exactly one of Claire's soccer games, which she has never let me forget, and which is honestly fair. By 2019, Briggs Transit operated in 14 states, employed over 800 people, owned its facilities outright, and had spent the previous decade being quietly courted by 3 different private equity groups who saw what I had built and wanted to own a piece of it. In March of 2019, I sold Briggs Transit to Meridian Logistics Holdings for $47 million and change, reinvested the majority of it through a financial trust managed by my longtime attorney, and retired to my house in Denton to drink coffee on my porch and make furniture in my garage. I didn't announce it. I didn't throw a party. The Denton Record Chronicle ran a small business section item about the acquisition that used the word undisclosed to describe the terms, and that was fine by me. Claire knew. Of course, Claire knew. She was 32 and working as a pediatric nurse at a hospital in Dallas, living in an apartment 40 minutes from my house, and we had dinner together most Sundays. She knew who her father was and what he had done with his life. She had sat in that rented warehouse as a child, doing homework at a folding table while I processed invoices. What she didn't know, what I had no way of anticipating, was that 6 months before Derek Calloway's family dinner, she would stop coming to Sunday dinners. That she would start apologizing via text message with reasons that felt constructed. That she would bring Derek to meet me exactly once, for 45 minutes at a coffee shop near her apartment, where he spent most of the time on his phone and the rest of it explaining how his approach to portfolio management was revolutionizing mid-market private wealth. I watched my daughter watch him talk, and I recognized the expression on her face. She was dazzled. Claire had grown up without the things that dazzle people. We'd been comfortable, but never flashy. And here was a man who wore a watch that cost more than a semester of community college, and spoke with the authority of someone who has been told he's exceptional for so long that it has become the organizing principle of his personality. I shook his hand when we left. I told Claire I'd see her Sunday. She said she'd try to make it. The invitation to the Calloway family home for dinner came through Claire via a text message, which arrived on a Saturday morning while I was finishing a coat of stain on a cedar chest I'd been building for 3 weeks. Derek's parents want to meet you. Dinner at their place in Highland Park next Saturday. Please come, Dad. It would mean a lot. I stood in my garage with wood stain on my hands and read that text 4 times. I want to be honest about something. I almost didn't go, not because I was afraid, but because I knew what I was walking into, and I'm old enough and patient enough that I don't particularly need to prove anything to anyone. I have had people underestimate me for 30 years, and the lesson I learned early is that letting people underestimate you is frequently the most powerful position you can occupy. But Claire said it would mean a lot, and she is my daughter. So I put on a clean shirt and my good boots, and I drove my dented truck up to Highland Park on a Saturday evening in November. The Calloway house was a 7,000 square foot colonial revival on a street where every house had a lawn crew and outdoor lighting designed by someone with a degree. Garrison Calloway, Derek's father, a vascular surgeon, met me at the door with a solid handshake and the careful warmth of a man who is genuinely good at social situations. His wife, Paulette, kissed my cheek and told me she'd heard wonderful things about me, which I doubted but appreciated. Richard Hartwell was there because he was always there. He was Derek's mentor, his professional father figure, his ticket, and his mirror. Derek had mentioned him twice in our 45-minute coffee meeting. Richard had founded Calloway Meridian with Garrison Calloway 20 years ago and had brought Derek in as an associate 6 years ago and elevated him steadily since. He was 68, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Dinner was a standing prime rib, which was excellent, and a Napa Valley Cabernet that Garrison opened with the quiet pride of a man who takes his cellar seriously. We talked about football first, as men in Texas do, and then about real estate. And then Derek steered the conversation where he'd been steering it all along. "I've actually been meaning to talk to you, Walter," he said, cutting his prime rib with surgical precision. "In my professional capacity, I waited. I understand you came into a bit of money when you sold your business." He said it the way you'd say, "I understand you found a 20 in an old coat. A few million? Something like that?" I didn't correct him. I picked up my fork. Because the way a lot of guys handle that kind of liquidity event, I see it constantly. They don't know what to do with it. They sit on cash, or they put it in index funds, or some cousin talks them into a car wash franchise. He smiled at me, man to man, generous with his expertise. "I've helped a lot of people in your position, Walter. People who worked hard, built something modest, and then found themselves with more money than they knew how to manage. There's no shame in it." The table had gotten very quiet. Garrison was studying his wine. Richard Hartwell was watching Derek with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I appreciate that," I said. "My fund returned 22% last year," Derek said. "To give you some context, the S&P was up about 24, but the risk-adjusted performance of what we're doing is genuinely differentiated. For someone in your situation, retired, limited income, needing the capital to work, I could make a real difference." "Someone in your situation," he said it gently. "The way you speak to someone you've diagnosed." "That's very kind of you," I said. He glanced at Claire, who was smiling at him the way she used to smile at me when I said something she was proud of. And something moved in my chest that I don't have the right word for. Then he turned back to me and said the thing about Richard, about how he'd told Richard I was retired, enjoying the simpler life, and about the handyman operation. And my daughter studied her napkin. Richard Hartwell set down his fork. He looked at Derek for a moment, not angrily, just carefully, and then he looked at me. And then he said the 5 words that I had not expected and that changed everything about that evening. "I know who you are." He said it quietly enough that only the 4 of us near the end of the table heard it clearly. Derek laughed. A quick social laugh. The punctuation of a man trying to move past something. "Of course, Walter Briggs, Claire's father." "Walter Briggs," Richard said, still looking at me, "sold Briggs Transit to Meridian Logistics Holdings in 2019. Meridian is a subsidiary of the Hargrove Group. I sat on the Hargrove Advisory Board from 2016 to 2021. The table had gone completely silent now. "I read the acquisition report," Richard continued. "The terms were not undisclosed to the board." He picked up his wine glass. "It was an impressive company, Mr. Briggs. Extraordinarily well run," the integration team said. It was the cleanest books they'd seen in a decade of acquisitions. Derek's face had done several things in rapid succession that his face was not accustomed to doing. I nodded at Richard. "Thank you. I had a good team." "What was the final figure?" Derek asked. His voice had changed. Something had left it. I looked at him and I thought about my daughter and I thought about a lot of things in a very short amount of time. "It was enough," I said. I drove home that night and sat on my porch for a long time without turning on the lights. Claire called at 10:15. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 10:40. I listened to the message. "Dad, please call me back. I'm so sorry about tonight. I don't know what Derek was thinking. Please call me." I called her back the next morning. "I'm not angry at you," I told her, which was mostly true. "I need you to understand something, though. A man who will speak about your father that way at a dinner table, in front of strangers, to make himself feel larger, that tells you something very specific about who he is, not about who I am." "He didn't know," she said. "He didn't know about the sale. He didn't ask," I said. "That's my point. He didn't know, and he didn't ask, and he still built a story about me and performed it for a room full of people. The money is beside the point entirely." She was quiet. "He would have done it if I had nothing," I said. "That's who he is." I heard her breathing on the other end. I waited. I have always believed the most important thing you can give a person you love is the space to arrive at their own understanding. "I need to think," she said finally. "Take all the time you need," I told her. "Sunday dinners are still open if you want them." She didn't come the next Sunday. What I did next is the part I've had to think carefully about. I did not call Richard Hartwell. I want to be clear about that. I did not reach out to anyone at Callaway Meridian Capital. I did not make a single phone call or send a single email designed to undermine Derek Callaway's professional standing. What I did was this. I called my attorney, Margaret Osei, who has managed my financial affairs since 2011, and I told her that I was interested in moving a portion of my trust into a more actively managed structure, and that I was exploring options. Margaret told me she had 3 firms she would recommend and would set up introductory meetings. One of the 3 firms she recommended was Callaway Meridian Capital. This was not a coincidence I manufactured. Margaret didn't know what had happened at the dinner. She recommended them because they were genuinely one of the better mid-market wealth management firms in the Dallas area, which Derek had also told me at dinner, and which turned out to be accurate. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the dinner. I wore my clean flannel shirt and drove my truck. I did not tell Claire. The Callaway Meridian offices were on the 32nd floor of a building in uptown Dallas. Good offices, clean and serious, with a view of the city that earned the rent. A receptionist brought me water and asked if I needed anything else while I waited, and I told her I was fine, and I sat in a leather chair and read an industry quarterly I found on the side table. Derek came out to get me at 10 after 9, which told me he didn't know who his 9 o'clock appointment was until he saw me standing up. He stopped. He actually stopped walking for a half second, the way a man does when his brain and his body momentarily disagree. "Walter," he said. "Derek." I shook his hand. His grip was different from the last time. "Thank you for fitting me in." He brought me to a conference room. He offered me coffee. He sat down across from me, and he opened a presentation on the wall screen, and he began to go through his fund's performance with the competence and fluency of someone who genuinely knew his material, and I want to give him credit for that because it's true he was good at his job. I asked questions, detailed questions. Questions about risk, structure, and fee arrangements and liquidity provisions and the underlying holdings in his core strategies. He answered them all correctly. He was starting to relax. The questions reassured him they were sophisticated questions, and sophisticated questions from a client meant a real opportunity. At 11:15, Richard Hartwell passed the open door of the conference room, glanced in, and then stopped. He looked at Derek. He looked at me. He came in. "Mr. Briggs," he said, extending his hand. "I didn't realize you had an appointment this morning." "I asked Margaret to keep it internal," I said. "I prefer to come in without any special arrangements." "Of course." He glanced at the screen. At the presentation. At Derek, who had developed a careful, unreadable expression that I suspected cost him considerable effort. "How is the meeting going?" "Derek's been very thorough," I said. "I have a few more questions about the illiquid alternative sleeve, but I'm getting a clear picture." Richard nodded. Something was moving behind his eyes. "What range of capital are you considering deploying here?" he asked. I told him. He was good enough not to react visibly. Derek was not quite as good. The number was considerably larger than anything his portfolio of modest retirement clients typically brought to an initial meeting. "I'll let you two continue," Richard said. "But Walter, could you give me 15 minutes before you leave? I'd like to reconnect properly." "Of course," I said. I sat with Richard for 40 minutes, not 15. He asked about the transition out of Briggs Transit. He asked about what I'd been doing with my time. He asked, with the directness of a man who has been in business long enough to not waste either party's time, whether I was genuinely interested in deploying capital, or whether there was another reason I had walked into his offices that morning. I thought about how to answer that for a moment. "Both are true," I said finally. "I am genuinely evaluating managers. And I am also," I paused. "I want to tell you what happened at the dinner. All of it. And then I want you to tell me what you do with that information, because that's your decision to make, not mine. I'm not here to engineer anything." He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "What you're describing," he said carefully, "is a pattern I've seen in Derek for the past 18 months. It has concerned me." He set down his coffee cup. "What he said about you at dinner, the Handyman operation. The implication that you needed managing, that's not just bad manners, Walter. In this business, that kind of behavior, that kind of judgment about a client before you know anything about them, it's disqualifying. That's your call to make," I said. "Yes," he said. "It is." We shook hands. I left. I did not hear from Richard Hartwell for 11 days. I didn't hear from Derek either, which told me he was waiting to see what I decided about the capital before making any other moves. On the 12th day, Claire came to Sunday dinner. She arrived at my door at 6 o'clock with a bottle of wine she'd picked out herself, a good one, which meant she'd asked someone at the store for help because my daughter knows freight logistics and pediatric care and she is spectacular at both, but she's never learned wine. She stood on my porch and she looked at me, and her eyes were red around the edges from what had clearly been a difficult few days. "I ended it," she said. "2 nights ago." I opened the door wider and let her in. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked. "Later," she said. "Can we just eat first?" I'd made chili. She sat at my kitchen table like she was 12 years old and told me about a patient at work who'd made her laugh that week. And I told her about the cedar chest I'd finally finished. And we didn't talk about Derek at all during dinner. After, over coffee, she asked me to tell her the truth about the sale, about the number, about all of it. I told her. She sat with it for a while. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me you were this?" She searched for the word, "this comfortable." "You never asked," I said. "And it didn't seem like it mattered. We were comfortable when you were growing up. You went to college. You got your degree. You're doing work you love. The number in the trust doesn't change who you are or who I am. But it changes what Derek." "No," I said. "Don't do that. Don't make the money the point. The point is what he did without knowing the money. If he'd known, he'd have been a completely different person at that table. What he didn't know is what's true about him. She was quiet for a long time. He called me yesterday, she said. He was very upset about something at work. He didn't tell me what. She looked at me. Did you have something to do with that? I considered the question carefully. I went to Callaway Meridian for a legitimate business reason, I said. I had a conversation with Richard Hartwell that I was honest about. What Richard does with information about his own firm and his own people is entirely his business. I didn't ask him to do anything. Claire studied me the way she used to study problems in school, methodically, from multiple angles, making sure she understood the whole shape of it before she decided what she thought. Okay, she said finally. Okay? Okay. I believe you. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. I also think you knew exactly what you were doing. I didn't say anything to that. Is that wrong? She asked. I've been asking myself that, I told her honestly. Here's where I landed. I walked into a business meeting with legitimate intent. I was honest with Richard about what happened. Derek's professional situation is the result of his own behavior that Richard already had concerns about before I walked in. I didn't manufacture anything or misrepresent anything. I let the truth sit in a room where it could do what truth does. I shrugged. You could argue I should have just walked away and let your relationship with him run its course. Maybe that would have been cleaner. No, Claire said. She said it with a conviction that surprised me. No, if you'd done that, I might have convinced myself the dinner was just a bad night, that he was nervous, that I was overreacting. She looked down at her coffee. I needed to see what he did when he thought the stakes were real, when he thought there was real money on the table. She looked up. He called me 3 times the day after his meeting with you. He didn't ask me how I was doing. He asked me if I thought you were serious about investing and what you'd said to me, and whether I could find out if you'd made any decisions. Her voice was even. 3 calls. He never once asked me how I was doing. I didn't say anything. You were right, she said. That's who he is. I got a call from Richard Hartwell on a Thursday morning 2 weeks later while I was on my porch with my coffee. He was brief and professional about it. I wanted you to know, he said, that we've parted ways with Derek. This is not something I'd normally share with someone outside the firm, but given the context of our conversation, I felt you deserved to know. It was a decision I'd been moving toward for some time. Your situation accelerated the timeline, but was not the sole cause. I appreciate you telling me, I said. I also want to say, he paused briefly, what Derek said at dinner was inexcusable. The judgment he showed, or failed to show, in assessing you before he knew anything about you. That kind of thinking has no place in this business, or frankly, in any room where people deserve to be treated as whole human beings. Another pause. He would have treated you the same way if you had nothing. I want you to know I understand that. Thank you, Richard, I said. That matters to me. Are you still evaluating managers? He asked, and I could hear the professional pivot, which was fair. I am, I said. I'd like to continue that conversation. But with your direct team? Absolutely, he said. I'll have my assistant reach out to schedule something. I sat on my porch after I hung up and drank my coffee and watched the neighbor's dog wander along the fence line the way he did every morning, nose down and purposeful about it. I thought about something Margaret had told me once, years ago, when I was in the middle of a particularly brutal contract negotiation with a carrier group that was trying to squeeze my margins down to nothing. She'd said, Walter, the most powerful position in any negotiation is the one where you have nothing to prove and nothing to fear. Get yourself to that position and then be patient. I had carried that with me for 20 years. What I had learned at the Callaway dinner table, what I had known, but that night made vivid again, was that people who need to establish their dominance immediately, in the first 10 minutes, before they know anything about the room, are people operating from fear. Derek Callaway had looked at my truck and my flannel shirt and my lack of business cards, and he had felt afraid, and so he had struck out to put me below him before I could put myself above him. That fear was his whole problem, and you cannot fix that from the outside. Claire came to Sunday dinners for the next 6 weeks in a row. She started looking like herself again. She has my mother's eyes and my stubbornness and her own extraordinary warmth. And when she's not performing the role of someone's appropriate partner, all three of those things show up naturally in a room. She told me about a 7-year-old patient who had drawn her a picture of a dog wearing a cowboy hat as a thank you gift, and she pulled out her phone to show me the photograph she'd taken of it, and she was laughing so fully and naturally that I had to turn away for a moment and look at the back fence. On a Sunday in January, she brought a man named Owen to dinner. Owen was 41 and taught high school history, and drove a car with a cracked bumper that he'd been meaning to get repaired. And when he shook my hand in the doorway, he looked me in the eye and said, "It's very good to meet you, sir. I've heard a lot about you," and I could tell from the way he said it that Claire had told him the actual story. All of it. In the way that you only tell the real version of something to someone you actually trust. I made chili again because Claire had told him I made good chili, and he'd said he'd love that, which is a low bar, but it's the right bar. After dinner, I took Owen out to the garage and showed him the cedar chest, and he spent a good 10 minutes examining the dovetail joints with genuine interest, asking how long I'd been doing woodworking, and what wood I preferred, and whether I ever sold any of it. "I give most of it away," I told him. He nodded like that made complete sense to him. When they left, Claire hugged me at the door and held on for a few seconds longer than usual, and I patted her on the back the way I'd done since she was small, and I didn't say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. I want to tell you something about being 63 and quiet, and driving a truck with a dent in it, through a world that has decided to mistake simplicity for defeat. I grew up with almost nothing. My father worked at a grain elevator outside Abilene, and my mother kept books for 3 small businesses. And we were not poor in the way that haunts you, but we were close enough to it that I understood early what money was for, not for showing, but for protecting, not for impressing, but for enduring. I watched my father work 40 years in a building full of dust and metal and heat, and he never once complained about it. And when he died, he left my mother enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, because he had been quietly and methodically building that security for decades, without ever talking about it. I built Briggs Transit the same way. Head down, eyes open, honest books, good people, patience. What I never understood, and what I have had to learn and relearn over the decades, is that there are people in this world who look at a man living that way and see only what's missing. They see the old truck, and they don't see the choice. They see the flannel shirt, and they don't see the freedom it represents. They see a man at a dinner table who doesn't talk about himself, and they construct a story about why he has nothing to say. Derek Calloway saw a story and told it loudly in a room full of people before he'd earned a single piece of it. That is the whole of the matter. I finished the cedar chest in December and gave it to Margaret as a Christmas gift. She cried, which embarrassed us both, and then she asked if I'd consider making one for her sister, and I told her to have her sister come by and look at some wood samples and tell me what she had in mind. The Callaway Meridian meeting with Richard's direct team went well. I moved a portion of the trust. It was a good decision, and it had nothing to do with Derek. On a Tuesday in February, I drove my truck to the hardware store to pick up sandpaper and a new belt for the sander. And the kid behind the counter, 19, maybe 20, with a name tag that said Jordan, looked at my truck through the window and said, "Man, that's a good truck. Those F250S run forever." "They do," I said. "My dad has one," he said, sliding my bag across the counter. "He says the only reason to get a new truck is if the old one stops running." "Your dad sounds like a smart man," I said. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat on my porch and watched the neighbor's dog work the fence line, nose down and absolutely certain of his purpose. The morning was cold and very clear, the kind of Texas winter morning that only arrives a handful of times a year, sky so blue it looks painted, air sharp enough to remind you that you're alive and breathing and present. I thought about Claire's face when she laughed at the picture of the dog in the cowboy hat. I thought about my father leaving my mother enough to endure. I thought about Derek Calloway, wherever he was that morning, starting over in an industry where your reputation is every single thing you have, having spent it at a dinner table trying to make himself taller by making me smaller. I didn't feel triumphant. That surprised me the first time I noticed it, But I've had enough time with it now to understand. The only thing that ever really mattered, the only thing that was ever actually at stake, was whether my daughter could see clearly. Whether she could look at a man who moved through the world with noise and certainty and surface, and ask the right questions about what was underneath it. She could. She did. That's the whole inheritance. Not the money in the trust, not the name on the company I built, not the 47 million in change. Just the ability to look clearly at the things in front of you and understand what they actually are. I built that in her the same way my father built it in me, not by talking about it, but by living it every day in front of her, quietly and without drama, for 32 years. She got it. Eventually, in a dining room in Highland Park, over prime rib and expensive wine, when the man she thought she loved introduced her father as a punchline to a room full of people who didn't know any better. She got it. That's enough. That has always been enough. I finished my coffee. The dog had reached the far end of the fence line and turned back with the same focused authority, already halfway through his next lap. I watched him for a while. Then I went inside, put on my boots, and went out to the garage to work.